Ladies and gentlemen, dear laureates, I'm happy that we can now start our third section today. And I want to introduce myself first. I'm Sigrid Jansen. I'm member of the Board of Trustees here, and I'm a trained microbiologist, and I retired as a professor in microbiology. My main topic was digestion of waste, of very different waste. For example, waste coming from the military, I say industry at the moment, and we will learn that there's not only military, but there's a big industry with military, and that this industry is really very dangerous, not when they are using the explosives, but before and after. If we have no war, we have still a lot of impact of military. And our first speaker will be, we change the law, will be Mr. Walker, and he will give us a talk about military impacts on climate change, sustainability, and environmental security. I think we have not much time, so I will not give an introduction to all the speakers. You can read this in this very nice program. All our speakers have a short vita there, so you can learn about our people who are speaking here now. So it's your turn. Thank you for coming again. Last year you was here, so I'm very happy to have you again here.
Thank you, and thank you for chairing too. Hi everybody. I'm only going to take about 10 minutes because I know we've started late because it's taken time for people to meander into the event. And I know there are 4 speakers, so and I'm very much looking forward to hearing our other speakers too. What I wanted to do today is just give you a sense of the importance of focusing on military actions and operations if you're interested in climate change. I mean, a lot of us work in foreign and military policy and non-proliferation and arms control and disarmament policy. And if you listen to the debate in the military, in military services around climate change, the question is always, how does climate change affect military activities? And you're probably well aware of that. We know sea rise may flood ports and naval facilities. We know that drought and extreme weather may impact migration, which in turn may impact conflict and violence or starvation and a variety of things. The military in general, and I'm talking primarily about the U.S. military now, but I think it's very common in all current militaries, focus mostly on how it will impact their current activities, how climate change impacts military. What I'm going to argue is you have to turn that on its head and ask, how does the military impact climate change? And so, we've heard a couple of presentations today on climate change. The word military was not once ever mentioned. And so what I'm trying to underline is it's important, if you're interested in climate change and carbon emissions, we have to really focus and better understand the biggest emitter of carbon in the world, and certainly in the United States. So let me quickly go forward. I only have 8 slides, I think, because I don't want to take up too much time. The U.S. military, and I use the U.S. military because I know this well. I used to oversee the annual military budget in the United States in my role in the House of Representatives on the Armed Services Committee. The U.S. military is actually the biggest single user of fossil fuels in the United States, and that says a lot. Now, I don't know really how it compares to other militaries. My guess is it's much bigger than other militaries, but if you look at the large militaries, Chinese, Russian, NATO forces, they're probably somewhat comparable, but probably a little bit less because of the high intense nature, capital nature of the U.S. military. If you compared fossil fuel use in the U.S. military to nations, to countries, the U.S. military would rank about 60th in the world. So there's 196 odd countries. And so there's about, 140 of those that use less fuel, as a nation, use less fuel than the U.S. military services. I mean, it's just enormous. Top 60, it's among the top 50 greenhouse gas emitters in the world. So if you ranked countries again on carbon emissions, you'd find that not the United States, but the U.S. military comes in about 50th. So there's 150 countries that emit as a nation less carbon than the U.S. military itself emits. The energy use in the U.S. military is about 71% petroleum-based. It's about 11% electrical-based, 8% gas, natural gas, 7% nuclear, and that's really nuclear submarines and nuclear aircraft carriers, 2% coal, and 1% renewables or other, solar, wind, geothermal. The U.S. military accounts for 80% of energy use in the U.S. government. So if you look at the whole U.S. government, which is very large, 80% is military. U.S. military uses, by estimate, this is a rough estimate, about 117 million barrels of oil per year. And most of that is actually in aircraft. Aircraft accounts for, jet fighters use jet fuel and long-range bombers and like. 73% is in aircraft, 15% in ground vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, jeeps, trucks and the like. 8% in ships. Most of the ships are diesel-fueled ships, except for nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and submarines. And 4% is in the built environment, installations. And the built environment is actually enormous, as you know, in the U.S. military. Another issue for you to be aware of is really weapons stockpile management. And I got very involved in this years ago, 20, 25 years ago. And one thing I never realized at the time, but most weapons that are produced are never fired. So you have to understand that say you produce 100,000 weapons, and it's millions and millions in the U.S. military arsenal, but about 90% of that is never fired. About 2 or 3% is probably fired in war somewhere, or regional conflict, in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever we're operating. The rest of it's fired in training on U.S. soil. So or around the United States in naval maneuvers. So you're left with 90% of your weapons stockpile, and this is very typical, I think, of most militaries around the world, that have to be somehow taken care of after 20 or 25 years in their lifespan. And so one of the biggest issues from an environmental and public health perspective is how do you deal with the 100,000 tons per year of obsolete munitions? And the typical way that the military historically, all militaries historically have dealt with this, is they take the weapons out, place them in, depending on the size of the weapon, but if they're small, say hand grenades, mortars, artillery shells, they'll put them in barrels. They'll put them in shallow holes in a big open field and blow them up. And so if you see this, I've witnessed this in what are called open burn, open detonation sites. And there'll be probably a lineup of 100 barrels that are, say, 1 meter below ground, and then they detonate it. And you can see the earth, big wave go across the earth as everything underneath the earth explodes. And they bring out bulldozers, and they dig it all up, and it's all debris, and all the toxic waste goes in the groundwater and the soil, and then they put in another 100 barrels. So it's basically what's called open burn, open detonation. As I say here, it releases thousands of tons of pollutants. So you get some air pollution from it, some carbon emissions, but a lot of it actually, in these cases, goes into the soil and the groundwater. A big issue. OBOD is very seldom talked about in the environmental community, but we're increasingly trying. I've always tried to make this a big, important issue. Unexploded ordnance. When you go to war or you fire on training ranges, at least 10% of your weapons never explode. And so you're left with all this very dangerous unexploded ordnance. You hear about this on a battlefield all the time. Mini munitions and kids getting killed, picking up the little, mini bombs, cluster weapons and the like later on. But in fact, it's an enormous issue on all military bases, primarily where you do training. And so you're left with thousands and thousands of unexploded ordnance weapons of all types on land and in the water, all around bombing ranges and training ranges. They're usually detonated in place. So if the military goes in and tries to clean up a training range, which they usually now, after we press this case over the last decade, they'll go in and actually try to detonate any weapon they can find to allow the training range to continue. Because if you can't enter the training range, in fact, you won't be able to use it again. And so it becomes very important for service members to continue to sort of clean as they go. But once again, if you detonate all these weapons in situ, because it's maybe the safest way to do, you wind up with enormous pollution, then toxic pollution in the ground and the groundwater. I'd point out in the United States alone, we have 4,849 formally used defense, almost 5,000 formally used defense sites. I never realized we even had that many military bases in the United States, but there's about 5,000 formally used defense sites which are all polluted and requiring this sort of cleanup. Chemical weapons. Some of you know I've been very involved in chemical weapons destruction for the last 22 years. It's potentially one of the very dirtiest and most dangerous situations we have, I think, from a toxic environmental and public health situation in the world. There have been 72,000 metric tons declared in 8 countries. I can talk about that more if you want later. 90% of that has now been destroyed, thank goodness. Since 1990, when the United States began burning its chemical weapons stockpile unilaterally, 23,000 metric tons have been burned. Of that, 65,000 destroyed, 23,000 have been burned in incinerators. And the big concern with incineration of anything, but in this case nerve agent and mustard agent and the like, is that in fact you're pumping out thousands of tons of atmospheric emissions every single day that these incinerators operate. So even though they have very intense scrubbers, and we learned early on that you had to actually backfit them with sulfur-impregnated carbon filters, because they turned out to be mercury and heavy metal in fact a number of the mustard stockpiles. It's still a very dirty technology. And there's been, as I say, 100,000 plus metric tons of toxic effluent burned. When you neutralize, which you can do too, do a wet chemistry operation for the first stage of chemical weapons, you still wind up in most cases burning the liquid effluent, which is usually 10 to 15 times the volume of the chemical weapon. Another issue I'd raise is rocket motor destruction. A lot of us in the arms control and disarmament community, are very much in favor of getting rid of strategic nuclear warheads and missiles and submarines and all the rest. But people never think that you have to destroy these things. You have to take care of them in some fashion. And this is one of the biggest former Soviet strategic ballistic missile tests, an SS-18. I think you can see a person standing next to it there who happens to be Senator Richard Lugar, former Senator Richard Lugar from Indiana, Republican from Indiana. But the typical way that the Russians and Americans and other countries destroy their ballistic missiles is to take off the thruster cones that we all know about when you see space shots and all the rest. So it doesn't provide too much thrust. You separate the stages of the missile, and then you strap it down on a big frame, and you light it. And so it burns the liquid fuel or the solid fuel, and there's both. The most modern ones are solid fuel. These things burn, pumps all the exhaust just out the back, and blows with the wind all downwind. They burn, like a typical rocket stage for 5, 6, 7 minutes. And then the rocket is empty, no longer dangerous for exploding or anything. And then they have to cut it up, and it's actually a very toxic piece of material too. And we've tried to work on doing closed burn and closed detonation processes, because oftentimes you can't scrape out the fuel. Very dangerous to do that. You can't wash it out necessarily. There have been efforts to try to save the fuel for, say, dynamite sticks for mining and things of that nature. A lot of people killed doing that. So in fact, you have to somehow burn the rocket once you've built it and it's not been used in, say, 20 or 25 years. And this produces enormous amounts of carbon emissions and downwind persistent organic pollutants. And let me just finish with a couple of conclusions here. What's to be done? As Lenin said, "Что делать?" At one point. Require environmental impact statements and permits for all military programs. Not necessarily the case today. Stop open burn, open detonation, and utilize closed burn detonation practices, which we can do. We have equipment that does that. It's just a little slower and more expensive, more involved. Utilize more controllable technologies. This actually, on the picture on the right you see there, is actually a closed detonation facility. That one actually built by the Japanese. It's a Kobe steel facility which is being used in China right now for closed detonation of old buried chemical munitions which the Japanese are cleaning up. Expand use of renewable technologies and military practices, and there's some work going on here. I mean, I think the United States has been researching, U.S. military has been researching a variety of renewable technologies for probably 20, 25 years now. Expand energy efficiency on military bases. Has to be a lot more investment in all your built environment. Continue research and development in controllable technologies. I mean, all these technologies for weapons destruction can actually and have spun off for high toxic waste management and waste management strategies in countries. And promote, obviously, recycling and reuse. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your overview. And now we know what the danger is outside of the war, because this is not inside the war. Of course, inside the war, we have all this again, and the explosive as well. But after and before the war, we had the military bases. And we have another speaker. This is Mozhgan Savabieasfahani.
Thank you.
So sorry.
No,
and she was working about the impact of what was talked by Paul to human being, and especially to unborn babies. And she saw seeing all what happens to the people living near these bases, these military bases, and what happens to the unborn child. Then she decided there must be an initiative to ban all these military bases all over the world and force the people who have put or set on these military bases to clean them. This will be a huge amount of money needed, but anyway, we have to start.
We have the money.
Yes, we have to start, and I think you will give us an as well short overview about the work what we have to do.
Yes. Well, I have to say it's an honor to be here. I was invited and I was completely thrilled. I've met many interesting people here, including Mr. Walker, whom I hope to work with in the future, because a lot of the things you said, and I thought I know about military industry, and what you said, it was very enlightening, and I didn't know a lot of it. So in the light of what you said, I think it is actually possible to clean military bases, not only in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in the United States, if there's 5,000 bases there that need cleanup. So I think we have the money. It's in the form of expenditure of military or army, things like that, and we can change the way we spend our resources so that we can clean what we have destroyed and also have funds to do it with, because it's technologically possible, and we just have to have a large campaign of massive numbers of people who support cleanup rather than war. So hopefully I can give you a little bit of, I only have 8 slides. My research in the past 7 years has focused on effects of war pollutants on people of Iraq, where I was able to connect with some Iraqi doctors who were complaining about increases in birth defects and cancers in their cities. The picture you see here, which one is the light? Is this the light? The red one? Okay. So these are my 2 colleagues, Dr. Al-Sabak from Basra Maternity Hospital, and his students who have helped with collection of some data. And this is Dr. Samira Al-Ani. She is now a refugee in Baghdad, but originally she worked at the Fallujah General Hospital. So she was the first woman who started seeing increases in birth defects in her patients. And then I contacted her when we started working on our research there. And I'm sorry if the date, it's actually, I've corrected it, good. It says 11th, because it was different before. So basically, these 2 publications, one Physicians for Social Responsibility report of 2015, and one the report of Institute of Medicine in 2011, these 2 tell me that our organizations and people who are supposed to take care of public and global health, they have failed big time. Very, very seriously they have failed. This is an account of how many people died in the Middle East since the war or the 2003 invasion of Middle East started. It puts the number of the dead alongside the number like 2 million. And about 20 million have been displaced. But this is conservative because the number of dead in Syria and the number of dead in Libya and in Yemen have not been included. So we might expect something much larger than 2 million actual dead people because of military ventures. This report shows how these burn pits, which Mr. Walker were talking about, how they affect the health of the individuals who live near and around them. This is a report by Institute of Medicine, a very prestigious organization that gives advice to the government of the United States. What they said is that our soldiers are getting sick because of these large, enormous burn pits that are present on US military bases in Iraq and Afghanistan. Since then, some good things have happened for some military personnel of the US, but this report completely ignores the health of women and children of Iraq who live much longer in their homes, and they live nearby, and they are physiologically more vulnerable to effects of pollution, war pollution. Again, what you said, Mr. Walker, about the fact that nobody mentions military pollution or military never comes to our discussion. It's a very important thing. Military is the top polluter of the planet. And in cycles with public health researchers, you never hear about pollution caused by war. I was the first one, and I am really a nobody in the field of epidemiology and toxicology. There are people who have been in the field for tens of years, and they should be talking about it. They should be talking about how war pollution carries for decades, and that never comes up. It is a very strange thing, and I would like to change that, because as students learn that pollution from war lingers for decades, they will be tuned into some different kinds of research. So, well, we'll go quickly. I don't want to. This is a quick look at U.S. bases in Iraq. These are the cities where we collected samples. This is Basra, Fallujah, and Hawija, where we have data from. And what we show is there is large amounts of lead and mercury in hair samples of the children. Lead poisoning and also poisoning from mercury, we have shown that in children of Fallujah and Basra and Hawija. I don't know if you guys have remember a couple of months ago the lead poisoning of children in Flint, Michigan. Have people heard about that? Some people have. So the issue here, which I'm trying to do, is to show people that the same lead poisoning on a much more massive scale is happening in the entire country of Iraq. We don't have data from Afghanistan, but if we did, we might see a similar scenario. So US military bases do a lot of things. They stockpile toxic material. They have tons and tons of various compounds they use to maintain their weaponry. All of these things could end up in your environment and could get a lot of people sick for a very long time. And I was very glad to hear Mr. Walker's presentation, because it was very much clarifying a lot of things for myself as well. So basically, since 2003, apparently there were these large burn pits on US military bases in Iraq and Afghanistan, where they burnt everything they didn't want to take back to the US. That's what I was told. And that includes computers, bombs, even like tanks. There's a large pits. And what that does, it releases mercury, lead, titanium. Everything that was in the bomb that you didn't want and you exploded ends up in the air, and it goes into the bodies of people. We have some data from this hospital in Basra. This is, oops, I'm sorry. This is Basra province, and these are the dates from where we have collected the data. The little green dots are the children born. that are healthy, and the little red dots are one child who was born and was malformed in 89 and 1990. And this is 2000. We have to fill in the gaps. This is only 4 years, but we're trying to do that. But what this shows you is each one of these triangles are 10 times more than that. So let me show you, you guys told me to delete my slides, so I don't have them. But basically what it tells you is that the number of birth defects in Iraq was quite low, about 1.37 per 1,000 live births. And it got up to 30 per 1,000 live births. And in some places, I am in touch with a Dr. Al-Shami on Facebook who says now the number of birth defects in Fallujah is 147 per 1,000 live births. It's scary. It's very scary. Whatever is happening, it's getting more and more escalated. More and more pollution, more and more birth defects in Iraq. So this is a fancy study we did. We looked at teeth from children in Basra who had survived and were losing their teeth. So we collected teeth from them and teeth from children in Beirut who are less exposed to military pollution now, and also children from Isfahan, my own city, where children have not been exposed to anything for a long time. So you can see the footprint of war in these children. They have 3 times more lead than Iran and 2 times more lead than Beirut. And the actual numbers are here. We can talk about it, but there's really no time. But basically what it tells you is we can see the footprint of war in the teeth of our children. If a child has this much lead in its tooth, how much does it have in its bones? You can be sure they are lead poisoned. Same as children in Flint, where there was a whole commotion. Why is Flint an important blueprint for us? Because in Flint, 2 academics stood up and they made sure everybody knows what lead is and how it affects children. And because of their work, the whole story changed, because they quickly were able to stop the polluting water. So that is what I am inspired to do. Here's I actually have a slide. So in Flint, there were 2 doctors. One, her name is Mona Hana Atisha, and there is Dr. Edwards at Virginia Tech. These 2 people managed to find out about this and quickly stop it. And I live in Ann Arbor when Mr. Schneider is our governor, and there is a grassroots movement to remove him because he failed so poorly to protect children in Flint. So basically what I'm saying is that when organizations who are in charge of global public health fail, it is up to us as academics to become advocates. We can no longer take so much time to do so much research when there are thousands of children who are being exposed to pollution and are dying. We are losing pockets of earth where women can have normal children. We have lost it in Vietnam. We have lost it in the Balkans. There's been so much bombings there. Now we are losing these pockets in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, you name it, Libya, Yemen. So it's our job to put an end to this. As we continue this way of behavior, we lose more clean places where women can have normal children. So this is basically saying there's a lot of laws, none of them can hold anybody responsible. But what we managed to do, me and a few colleagues at the University of Washington and their students, we passed a resolution by American Public Health Association asking the government of the United States and the Army to clean military bases in Iraq and Afghanistan. I want to invite everybody to take this step and not only speak about war pollution, but also push so that those who created these pollutions will be forced to clean it. I am convinced if my colleagues after the Vietnam War forced the government of the United States to clean Vietnam, maybe Iraq would never have happened. If people who throw bombs realize they have to clean it up afterwards and it costs them, maybe they will think twice about doing it again. So I'm hoping not only to help clean my neighbor country, Iraq, but also prevent this from happening again. Thank you so much. Please ask me questions. I don't want to take forever. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. And I think there are now a lot of questions, and I want to combine these two talks, and we should, you should ask your questions as well to Paul and to Mozhgan. So who should be the first one? You have the microphone, okay. Yeah.
I'm privileged. What about, can you make a difference between depleted uranium ammunition and some toxic chemical ammunition concerning the deformation on the children?
Well, I tell you, can you hear me well? Yeah. I tell you, there is some information about how much depleted uranium was dropped on Iraq. It's about 2,000 tons that was dropped across Iraq. And undoubtedly, that amount of radioactive material is in the Iraqi environment. And it is making its impact on the developing fetuses, on the pregnant mothers and all that. But what we have not been able to detect uranium in our samples from Iraq. So my data doesn't show that there is exposure to uranium or depleted uranium. But if it is in my mind very clear that we haven't sampled the correct spots. If we sample the correct spots, we will be able to tell. But as far as the effects, they are similar to lead. Even lead, which we found a lot of, is more toxic than uranium. But uranium and its compounds, they are radioactive, and they cause increases in cellular toxicity, and they affect the fetus just as well and just as badly.
So I think you should be the next one. Yes, you please. And then after you.
I got a brief question, the comparison. The Freiburg was bombed exactly 70 years ago. And I lived at Seepark, 2 miles from here. And they're still today boring holes in the ground looking for phosphor bombs. It's no joke. 70 years later, they continuously find bombs. Last Sunday in the university. And it never ends. And this is 70 years ago. Now comes the question to you. The Iraq war started exactly March 21st, 2003 or something. It was spring full moon, which we have in 10 days here too. So 10 years later, it must be just horrible because the bombing of Freiburg was only 20 minutes and it was gone. Yeah. This was more than 20 minutes, what we experienced.
And I tell you, the military power is much more severe now than it was 70 years ago. And the compounds they introduce into the environment are much more toxic now than they were 70 years ago. But I think, nevertheless, it is upon us to challenge the use of our resources, resources that goes into military development and military production, and all these tons of bombs that are unexploded. And a lot of those actually were exploded on military bases in Iraq. So it's our challenge to redirect our resources as a human society. So much goes in. I had a slide showing the U.S. Military expenditure per year, each year, and you can see the difference between the U.S. and even China. The U.S. is way out there. So when I emphasize U.S., I don't have special grievances with U.S. It's just that it's where I live, and it is where I see massive amounts of resources go to military. I worked at the university, and everything was, we don't have the money. Where is the money? The money goes to the military, and we have to change the direction of it. Change it to research and to clean up. So that's my...
Now Alyn, please. And then...
Thank you. 2 questions from Paul. A lot of NATO publications and reports are coming out now saying how much greener the military bases in Europe are and the NATO forces. Is that a farce? And the second question is, the Paris Agreement left out, I think, 3 key sectors: shipping, airlines, and military. Is there any process to get these sectors into any follow-up agreements to the Paris Agreement? And if so, are there any campaigns to get the military sector, which you have indicated is such a big contributor to climate change, into any follow-up to the Paris Agreement? Thank you.
Well, those are good questions, Alan. On the Paris Agreement, the military has worked very hard over the years not to be included in any of this at all.
And that's why you'll hear when we talk about the military and climate change, what I started off saying, it's always how will climate change affect the military, it's not the reverse. And that's why I've tried to raise the issue in a variety of Washington, D.C. forums. I've asked, Assistant Secretaries of Defense and others, what's the effect of the military on climate change? And they say, no, not really, very minimal, don't worry about it. So I don't know of any follow-up process. I mean, I think as environmentalists and all, we should really work on that. But on the other hand, though, there is an Assistant Secretary for Economic and Environmental Affairs in the U.S. Department of Defense, and I think most militaries today, all the major ones around the world, must have offices of environmental cleanup. The challenge is really, as you say, Mozhgan, it's really money, and I was very involved, in base realignment and closure commissions, what we call the BRAC rounds, when we closed, these 5,000 bases and more, that many of us never even realized there were that many in the world, let alone the United States. And the challenge has been that the money just isn't there. Even though the U.S. military budget now is approaching $700 billion per year, which is larger than the gross national product of most countries in the world. And it's about equivalent to every other military budget in the world combined. It's like the United States, number one, and then the other 195 countries combined sort of make up the other 50%. And of course, if you added in NATO, of course, then it would be U.S. and NATO probably make up, at least 75% of military spending and another 25% all the other countries of the world combined. So the capital-intense nature of the U.S. military is large, the cost is large, but the environmental cleanup money is about less than 1% of the U.S. military budget. And that's always been a challenge. It's been that way for years. On the other hand, the U.S. military has been very, I think, foresightful in trying to push forward with renewable strategies. Renewable strategies, electric vehicles. I remember 20 years ago watching a drag race, for example, of a M1 Abrams tank, which is one of the best in the world, which uses a jet engine, turbine engine in the back, versus an electric-powered tank. And the electric-powered tank won the race because the torque in electric motors, of course, is so great. And so there has been thought given to trying to replace fossil fuel vehicles, particularly those like an M1 tank that gets 50 gallons to the mile of fuel, and which is one of its big problems because it runs out of gas after about 50 miles. But it's not been big enough. There really hasn't been enough research and development. That's why I emphasized we need more R&D and renewable resources. Not that, my bias would be we should stop almost all military activities, period. But we understand that's not going to happen maybe in our lifetime. So you really have to introduce renewable, environmental impact statements, public health impact statements, all the rest to this work.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a topic we should have again on this here in this convention. And I'm sorry, we have two other speakers, and I do not want to skip their time. Maybe we have at the end, we have some minutes left. But anyway, at 3 o'clock, at really short, then there will be the photo downstairs. So we are not allowed to overdraw our... So we have 45 minutes. We have now 45 minutes we had already this time. So, and I want to say something about the money we need. We will need a tremendous amount of money because at the moment we are only discussing the elements and the elements which are toxic. But these bombs and all these guns, they release as well more complicated chemicals. For example, these trinitrotoluol, this TNT. And I was working personally on this, how this is degraded if it is in the ground by microorganisms. We do not know, after 20 years of research, we really do not know exactly what happened, because these compounds were converse to other compounds, and you do not know. You may have an idea what can happen, but you do not really know what is the metabolism in the ground. So for some of these compounds, we know they are much more toxic than the TNT. And it's very hard to clean the soil because it goes down and down and down. With every rain, every year, it goes deeper into the soil. And at the end, so we have this in Lower Saxony, there was a factory for the Second World War, and now we have this TNT very near to the groundwater. And this groundwater is used nowadays to serve to millions of people. So nobody discusses this because it's don't touch this topic. So you will find nothing in the newspaper, and you will find no discussion, open discussion about this. But the danger is really very great, and we have it all over the world. So it's not only that we have the things what we see, we have a lot of unseen things which are really very dangerous. But with this, I want to stop this. And the next speaker, we can say, why is there nobody talking about this? What happens? Why is we have the UN and we have a lot of organizations? Is there nobody who is really convinced that he has to do something? No, there are people. And our next speaker, I think he will give us as well a short information about what he is doing in this situation or in this topic. This is Alyn Ware from New Zealand, and he will talk about the United Nations Unfold Zero and Article 26. This is for disarmament, global governance and security, sustainable security, not just for the moment. If you see not, then we are secure. No, sustainable security.
Thank you very much. I'm from New Zealand, working for Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. So we have an international network of cross-party parliamentarians working on nuclear disarmament issues. And I'm also with Unfold Zero, which is United Nations Unfold the Path to Nuclear Zero, a nuclear weapons-free world. What I'm going to be talking about today is pretty much a follow-on from where Paul left off, which is on the economics of militarism. I'll mention nuclear disarmament, not just the nuclear weapons budget, but also some of the approaches and initiatives to replace militarism with cooperative or common security, or as we say, sustainable security. There's different terms used for that. So just a quick recap. Paul mentioned the military spending budget in the United States, about $700 billion. The global military spending is about $1.7 trillion per year. We know it's cost a lot to finance accomplishment of the Sustainable Development Goals. The military spending could finance probably about 2/3 of that if we weren't spending all that money on the military. And just look at comparison, the amount that the UN annual budget is $5.5 billion. That's a tiny amount compared to the amount that's spent on the military. So the priorities are really obscure and really out of kilter there. I mentioned nuclear weapons though, because that's also got a concern with the possibility of nuclear conflict. We are lucky that we haven't had nuclear weapons used in wartime since 1945. Of course, they've been used about 2,000 times with the nuclear tests, and the environmental consequences of those have been horrific. And right at the moment, we have Marshall Islands in the International Court of Justice up in The Hague on a case on nuclear disarmament. But the reason why they're so passionate is because they've totally lost a number of islands already to the nuclear tests. There were already nuclear nomads been shuffling from island to island because of the nuclear tests. And now it's combined with climate change, which is starting to wash over their islands. These two threats of nuclear weapons and climate change are both existential threats to survival, to humanity. We already have, as I said, nuclear nomads, nuclear refugees. We're now starting to get the same with the climate change. So this court case, which is in the Hague at the moment, is not just about nuclear disarmament. It's also a precedent for international obligations on climate change, for example. That's one of the reasons why Marshall Islands is taking this case. And the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists made this connection also. In January this year, they said that the existential threats to our survival and to future generations come from nuclear weapons and climate change. And they're so severe that they set the clock, the doomsday clock, at 3 minutes to midnight. So we're looking in a sense that these are issues that are linked and that some of the solutions can help both. It's not just the threats are similar, it's also some of the solutions. And one of those is in the financing. The amount of the money that's been spent on nuclear weapons, for example, could be reallocated into the sustainable development, climate protection, climate prevention, and those issues. But not just to climate. I mean, the Article 6 of the UN Charter is actually a requirement on the UN Security Council to put forward a plan for disarmament, for lowering armaments in the world in order to release resources for economic and social need. So it's actually an international legal obligation to do this. And a few years ago, you may recognise this person, Oscar Arias, who was the president of Costa Rica, this was his second term, raised this and had a special session of the Security Council saying, what are we doing to implement that obligation? Now, of course, he couldn't get them to move because the biggest producers of weapon systems have got veto power in the Security Council. But it was really important to raise it at that international level because that's now helped some of the campaigns, civil society campaigns, to take this forward. So there's a huge campaign. It's the next month is April 5th to the 18th is the Global Day of Action on Military Spending. And it gives some support to that campaign with actions all around the world to say, actually, it's a requirement under the UN Security Council. There are also some other initiatives. Don't Bank on the Bomb is one you may have heard about. And that is where PAX, an organisation in the Netherlands, has put forward a list of banks which are investing in nuclear weapons. And if you have your bank account in one of those banks, you could go into that bank account and say, I'm closing my bank account. I'm going to go to a bank that doesn't invest in nuclear weapons. We have it at national level, and this is a combination of civil society working with parliamentarians in Norway, in New Zealand, in Switzerland. There is law now that the public funds should not be investing in nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. So this is part of the divestment campaigns. So those are a few different ways that we can take action to implement this obligation. But one of the things that one of the reasons it's difficult to move the governments is they keep saying, well, it's all very well, this, our obligation under Article 26. They don't say there's no obligation. They just say, but we need these weapons for our security. The world is a dangerous place, and so we have to have nuclear weapons to protect ourselves against some aggressor. And they'll always find an aggressor somewhere. If there's not one around, they'll invent one. And that's the justification for having huge defence budgets. One way to counter that is to demolish that myth and say, well, they don't provide the security. And that's a very important part of the campaign. Delegitimise the idea. Show how bad it is to have a military response to some of these situations. But the other one is also to highlight that there are alternatives. The alternatives are not just possibilities, they're actually there, existing, and are being used. In the United Nations Charter, it actually lays down an obligation that if you have a conflict between countries, you're not allowed to go to war. Article 2.4 says you're not supposed to use the threat, that you're not supposed to threaten or use force. There's only a tiny little exception if you're already attacked and until the United Nations acts. But countries ignore that. The other thing many ignore, not totally, and I'll give some really good examples of countries that don't ignore that, but the other part they don't ignore is even before you get to thinking of a military response to a threat, where it's some aggressive country, you have to go through peaceful means, negotiation, mediation, arbitration, adjudication. These are all listed down as the first ways to resolve those conflicts. And the UN has mechanisms to assist with that. So for arbitration, there's the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And just to give one example of how it's being used at the moment, you may know about the tensions in the South China Sea, where China is building platforms on these islands, and Japan and Philippines and Malaysia and Indonesia are all saying, hold it, these are disputed islands, they're in the ocean. We also have rights there. And there's been provocative military actions, Japan and China and US, very, very threatening. Well, the Philippines has taken a different route. With the island that they've got disputed with China, rather than threatening military response, which just gets worse and worse, they've taken the case to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which is sitting in The Hague. And there have been cases where that's worked in the past. Look at Russia and Norway. They had a dispute on the delineation of the continental shelf that's running from the north of Norway and Russia all the way up to the North Pole. Now, you may remember Russia was being very provocative. They had a submarine that went up to the North Pole and planted their flag on the sea floor, claiming the North Pole for Russia. Canada responded by saying, we're going to send more military forces up into the Arctic. But Norway took a different route. They said, why don't we take this to the Law of the Sea Tribunal? It's set up under the Convention of the Law of the Sea, and Russia is a party to it, Norway is a party to it, and it includes in there, if you have a dispute, you could take it to arbitration or adjudication. And they took that. It took about 3 years to sort it out through the Law of the Sea Tribunal. But in a sense, it was a face-saving way for both countries. Because when you take one of these approaches, a legal approach, a cooperative security approach, then you can more easily live with the result, even if it goes against you. Because you're not giving in to the other side. You're not being weak and giving into what's seen as the enemy. But you're upholding international law. So you can keep yourself and elevate yourself and keep your pride as a country and yet resolve it in a compromised way in general. And so Russia and Norway agreed, and they now have a peace agreement with regards to that delineation. There are many, many other examples. How I got involved in this, because my career started as a teacher, was because I saw how useful these mechanisms were for us in New Zealand. We're a very small country. We don't have a big military. We're big, powerful countries in the Pacific. And when France was testing nuclear weapons in French Polynesia, New Zealand took France to the International Court of Justice. And through that case, we managed to force France to stop its atmospheric testing. We then followed up later on with the underground testing, got that ended, and now France has closed down their nuclear test site and has signed on to the Test Ban Treaty. So I saw that this was, and we've had other examples, the Rainbow Warrior bombing, the Greenpeace boat that was bombed in our harbour, another huge dispute with France, and we solved it through mediation with the good offices of the United Nations Secretary General. Those are just a few examples. There's many, many more, but we often don't hear about them because the news media have a much better time. They much more enjoy showing bombs and wars. But when there's peace, it's not such big news. So you don't hear about these cases as much. I mentioned the United Nations, but that's not the only cooperative security or common security framework. There are also others, regional ones, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which I think that if it didn't exist, we'd have a full-scale war in the Ukraine at the moment. It was the OSCE which helped mediate for the agreements there and monitoring them. It's not perfect. The whole thing's not resolved. It's managed the conflict, not resolved it so far. But without it, I think we would have had a much worse war. And there are other mechanisms in other regions, and one of them that's been quite popular and has been very, very helpful has been the establishment of nuclear weapon-free zones. They're in a few areas, and now there are proposals for one in Europe, one in Arctic, one in Northeast Asia, and one in the Middle East. So these are, again, alternatives to the idea of threatening nuclear weapons against other states with nuclear weapons. If you create a nuclear weapon-free zone, it's a cooperative security environment. A lot of these ideas are like playing out amongst the lawyers and diplomats, but we're trying to get them out into civil society as well. So we recently brought mayors, parliamentarians and religious leaders together on a joint statement. It's just one page, not too long, but it puts forward these ideas of common security, that a nuclear weapon-free world is a common good. You could say the same about climate change. And climate change, prevention of climate change has been a common good. But we were working on the nuclear weapons issue, and we had parliamentarians from across the political spectrum, mayors from around the world, religious leaders from all the different major religions, and that was demonstrating to the diplomats. This one is in Geneva, where there are deliberations on multilateral approaches to nuclear disarmament. It demonstrates to them that there is a civil society movement out there, because they don't see it in the streets, so we have to bring it in other forms. One other key thing in global governance, which is really interesting and is worth paying attention to, is the appointment of the next UN Secretary General. All previous appointments or elections to them have been done in secret. The Security Council has basically decided who's going to be the Secretary General, and it's been rubber stamped by the UN General Assembly. It's now open. So we already have the nominations there. There'll be an interactive process, and as civil society we can ask, what's going to be the approach of these candidates to these core issues for humanity. And we have a lot of this debate on cooperative security and on nuclear disarmament and on demilitarization on the Unfold Zero website. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Just in time, so I think 2 or 3 questions, if the question is short, and the answer is short as well. So now you have, Winfried, please, you have raised your hand already for the last talk. And then
just a very quick question. I totally support the nuclear weapon-free world. How would you actually deal with North Korea?
So we have a proposal for a Northeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone that the North Koreans are interested in. If you have a look at when North Korea left the Non-Proliferation Treaty and developed nuclear weapons, and the reason they gave, it was because they said it came after Libya and Iraq invasions. And what they said is, well, look what happens when you get rid of your weapons of mass destruction. The Iraqi ones had been eliminated by the United Nations. In Libya, it was voluntarily given up by Gaddafi to try and rebuild relationship with Europe. And then both regime change in both those countries. It was after that North Korea left the Non-Proliferation Treaty, said that the agreement from '92 on demilitarization was now no longer valid, and that's when they tested nuclear weapons. What North Korea is saying is that they need some security, that they won't be attacked, that their regime won't be changed by war. So with a nuclear weapon-free zone, you have those guarantees. So the states within the zone, they pledged not to have nuclear weapons, and it's verified through the International Atomic Energy Agency. But in return, they get guarantees from the nuclear weapon states that they won't be attacked with nuclear weapons. So that's why it's a cooperative security approach. If you just put pressure on North Korea and say you're bad, you've done wrong, you have to give them up, without others giving up the nuclear option, Japan and South Korea are still under extended nuclear deterrence. You've got the United States sort of with possibilities of nuclear weapons against North Korea. You're not going to get Korea to say yes. But if you have a cooperative security where all countries have to give up the nuclear option, it's quite likely you could get them to say yes.
Yeah, Alan, I've worked with parliamentarians and politicians in the UK since about 1985 on issues you've been talking about, and similarly worked with the British media. And I would say actually over that time period, there's been a declining interest in using the framework that you've discussed rather than an increasing interest. And in fact, there's no longer any correspondence that I know of for the British media based at the UN in New York or the UN in Geneva. You have stringers, but not actual correspondence. So my question is, how do we get people to, the general public to get interested in this, and our parliamentarians, when the media just refuses to publish and discuss these issues in the way you've explained it, and only concentrates on the explosions and the invasions and the hardware and all that kind of thing, and you just can't get space in the media, mainstream media at least, to get these issues on the agenda?
Well, 2 approaches. One, we use the other media, social media. The One for 7 Billion campaign that I showed you, which was successful in changing the procedure for the new UN Secretary General, there was virtually no mainstream media on that campaign. and yet they managed to get enough political momentum to change that process in the UN. So using the social media is one option, but also challenging the existing media. And I know in the UK there has been some attention to the big march that was last weekend that CND organised, incredibly huge march. There's also some attention now that the UK is in court, and there's a number of articles, on the Marshall Islands case in the ICJ in UK media. The other thing that's prompted a little bit more just recently is Jeremy Corbyn, the new leader of the Labour Party, who's made a very strong anti-nuclear platform, which is far ahead of his own party. He's one of the members of our organisation. We've worked for many years on nuclear disarmament before he became the leader of the Labour Party. But he's challenged the UK thinking, because he said, if I become elected as Prime Minister, I would not authorise the use of nuclear weapons. And that challenges the whole idea of nuclear deterrence. So that's created some media as well. So I think there are opportunities to get into the mainstream media. If you've got a case in the International Court of Justice or the leader of one of the parties. The other thing is the mainstream media also, which was very good, paid a lot of attention to the Iran deal. And I was very happy that it paid a lot of attention to that, because the Iran deal shows that diplomacy can succeed, even when you have two countries, the US and Iran, that have got a long history of antagonism towards each other, and huge constituencies within those countries that did not want an agreement. Yes. And so the media attention really helped them to be able to secure that agreement. And I think we should keep using that. We can use the Iran deal as an example of how diplomacy can work, good diplomacy.
Thank you very much for these answers. But now I think we should not be very hopeless, because there are a lot of people who try to do their best. But I think the best would be to eliminate the reasons for wars. So to have peacemakers. And I think one of the biggest peacemaker is the renewable energy. A lot of wars are because of energy. And now we are going to have the talk of Keith Wheaton-Green, and he will tell us what he is doing in his little small area compared to the huge area we are discussed up to now. But if in every country, every community, renewable energy would be used, then I think a lot of ideas to have wars will be eliminated. So should I say your talk will be, but you can read it, so it's not necessary to say it again.
Thank you very much. Does this work? That's okay. Yeah, mine's a geographically based project. You probably know that the English are actually a tribe of German origin who forced a cultural takeover on the British island and occupied most of it about 1,200 years ago. Beer, sausages, that sort of thing. And I'm starting to describe myself as English just in case I have to get used to it, because after June I find myself in a country that's out of the EU, with Scotland wanting to go independent and get back into the EU. So let's hope that doesn't happen. But, it is a worry. We are worried about it. I live in the southwest of the UK. Yes, there we go. The sort of green area, the sunniest area of the UK. I work and get paid in Somerset, and I live and work voluntarily in Dorset. The English have a bit of an obsession with landscape and heritage. It actually defines our identity, I suppose. But the trouble is, it also does lead to some people sort of walking backwards into the future, not able, of course, to see where they're going or where we need to be going. This is especially a bad thing when it comes to large wind turbines. I think they're beautiful and necessary, but whenever I go to a planning meeting to speak up for them, I'm always very much in the minority, unfortunately. A lot of people actually really hate them. Luckily for the environment, this same attitude means that fracking is very unlikely, I would say, to get support, even though our government are very much in favour of it and give it a strong support. Civil society in the UK is, it underpins our social cohesion, and actually 39% of English people volunteer their time to work for no money, and others often follow their enthusiasm. So I wonder perhaps this is the same throughout Europe. I think it perhaps is. Certainly, whenever 3 or more English people get together on more than one occasion to discuss matters of mutual interest, they instinctively elect a chairman, a secretary, a treasurer, and thereafter they manage their affairs with reasonable integrity and honesty. And their interests usually benefit society as a whole. So it's generally a good thing. In 1999, I was working as Agenda 21 coordinator for South Somerset District Council. There's Somerset again. And I tried unsuccessfully to put landowners, farmers, in touch with wind turbine developers to get some wind turbines installed. Unfortunately, with the help of national organisations of dubious funding, the campaigning against these wind turbines was very successful, and not a single one has been installed in Dorset yet. Not large wind turbine, anyway, there are some small ones, and there's only one in Somerset. So that didn't go very well, unfortunately. I had a lot more success with small run-of-river hydropower. Mill owners, I discovered, were quite keen to get together and to share their skills and turn their historic mill sites into mini power stations. I invited as many as I could to an initial meeting, and I offered them council money. And if I'd put £100 of council money each mill site, would they match it for feasibility work to see whether it would actually work for them? They agreed, most of them, and they agreed that they would meet again. So, of course, I immediately elected a chairman, secretary, treasurer, and that South Somerset group, hydropower group, has been meeting now ever since 2002, I think, at each other's sites on a rotation every few months. So I've been acting as the catalyst, using the credibility of the council to get people together, make grant applications, employ the right consultants, and get the necessary permissions, and then persuade the mill owners to invest in their own sites instead of their hydropower. And there's the group there. That's South Somerset, that district there. And there are the mill sites that have been developed there. So there were 10 in the initial group, and 9 of those sites have actually been developed now. We got £135,000 of money from government to develop. I mean, once we'd got that money, of course, then obviously it's worth the mill owners meeting again and again to distribute that money fairly. So the success of the venture, I'd say, is demonstrated by the fact that since 2004, we now have 9 turbines installed by the group. I'll move on to the next slide. One of the mill owners, for example, Keith Schumark there, he even built his own Kaplan turbine in his own workshop, actually sort of did the mouldings and to a sort of well-established design, but he managed to get something that probably cost him about £20,000 instead of buying a sort of an Offsberger Kaplan turbine, which cost him about £90,000. Another member of the group, I didn't mean to do that. Another member of the group, Quake Taylor, he decided that the crossflow turbine that he'd bought from a manufacturer in Cornwall wasn't as good as something he could build himself. So he thought, well, I'll build one then. And he just turned up to a meeting one day with it in the back of the car and said, I'm going to start building these. What do you think? And he's built about 50 of them now and exported them around the UK. And he now is the only UK manufacturer of crossflow turbines. And he would argue that it's much better value than anything else you can buy anywhere else in Europe. I don't know why he doesn't export them, but maybe he will start doing that at some time. And we also spawned an installer. Guy Galpin here is another mill owner, and he and a chum of his sort of started installing mainly screw turbines, but they've installed quite a few different types of turbines now. I think they've probably installed about 20 to 30 sites now. So from that one group, a lot of hydro expertise was created. From my initial ignorance, I've become an independent hydropower consultant outside of South Somerset, so there's no conflict of interest there. So I've been working for clients to get the necessary permissions and to manage their installations. And this year I'm going to be introducing a Polish screw turbine to the British market, Hydromu, because it's very cheap, and we're in need of some cheaper turbines. There we go. Yeah. There are actually over 40,000 historic mill and weir sites in the UK where hydropower could be installed. Quite often there's this situation here where you have the original river, the course of the original river, and then there's a man-made, sorry, the other way around, here, this flow's going that way, and there's a man-made leat or canal which is level, and then there's a drop, and that's where the historic mill is. And sometimes there's been a mill on that site for 1,000 years. Not the same building, of course, but they tend to be ancient, interesting buildings, sometimes falling into repair, but now they can be modernised by having a sort of new mini power plant in them, which earns money, and it's generally a good thing. After we had our 9 or so installations, because it was part funded by British government, they made use of the funding and got us on television, and it was very well publicised. And I had a lot of requests from all across the country to give presentations, which spread the idea even more, and other groups actually set up because of that. One of the downsides with this installing hydropower is that our Environment Agency often expect a new fish pass to be installed somewhere around there, so that fish, despite the fact they haven't been able to get up there for perhaps 800 years, they now expect fish passage, and they expect the hydropower project to pay for that. I think the Environment Agency should pay for it. But you can't get a licence without installing that fish pass, so that's a real irritation. You might have noticed, yes, you might have noticed this, and it's just that whenever I see that huge amount of water, I just have to do it, which obviously is to measure the head of water with a very yellow tape measure. When in 2004, I met a fellow hydro enthusiast, and he was interested in setting up a mill owners group. He'd seen me on TV, and it's near where I live, so I couldn't help but get involved. We visited mill sites, Dorset mills, looking at the map, just sort of thinking there's a mill, knock the door, uninvited, and then just talk to them about the potential for hydropower and see if they'd go with it. We invited them to a meeting, and they came along. So we had a new Stour and Vale hydropower group. I mean, you can just see that it's got the red dots. That's the Stour catchment in Dorset, and every red dot is where there's a historic mill site, and that's sort of the same across the whole of the UK, possibly across the whole of Europe. There are mill sites all over the place, and wherever there's a drop, you could put hydropower in. Here's the county of Dorset, where I live. I live around about sort of here somewhere. And there are two main catchments. So that was one mill group. And then around about, a bit later, around about 2006, I met another hydro enthusiast who was living in Bridport, a young chap, and he wanted to do a dissertation for his undergraduate study on the potential for hydropower in Dorset. So the two of us together went around measuring flows, very useful for my work, got him his degree. He now works for a hydropower company. But between the two of us, we set up another hydropower group based on these catchments here. That group, the Stour and Vale group still meets, about once every 3 months. They've still got sites to develop. The West Dorset group, unfortunately, has ceased to exist now, but still something might come of it eventually, perhaps. But there are now groups in other parts of the UK that have followed a similar path. That's sort of Herefordshire. There's a Mendip group and an East Devon group. They're doing the same sort of thing, although I don't have contact with them. I don't go to their meetings, but I know more or less what they're doing. These are the North Dorset, or the Dorset installations. The group decided that they want to demonstrate different technologies. So of the three that have been installed so far, there's a cross-flow turbine. That one there was actually made by Quake Taylor from the South Somerset Hydropower Group. That there was installed by Guy Galpin from the South Somerset Group. And that one there is a design, the same design as Keith Schumacher's Kaplan turbine. I tried to get a company in Dorset to go into a manufacture of these Kaplan turbines. They only ever made 2, unfortunately, and then they went into liquidation for other reasons, nothing to do with the hydro. But he has got a copy of that in a Kaplan turbine. Because I work part-time for the council, and I'm known for my expertise with renewable energy, it's given me the chance to work independently, both voluntarily and sort of professionally, so I can facilitate other hydropower projects across the UK and small wind turbines, PV, wood boilers, and acting as an independent consultant. And for that reason, I was put forward for the South West Environmental Champion Award, which is one of the reasons why I'm here. So working for the District Council, which I still do 3.5 days a week, we have a carbon reduction team, and our most successful projects so far have been photovoltaics. We've got 5 council-owned buildings with that installed, ranging from 15 to 90 kilowatts. The beauty, of course, is it's at the generation peaks at the middle of the day, which is exactly when consumption peaks. Our most recent installation, this one here, it uses more sophisticated technology than previous. Each panel is monitored individually, and we have this web-based monitoring system. So the red is consumption in the building, and the blue is generation. And this is early February. So you can see by June, these blue bits are going to be right up into the red, and they're going to be pulling the red peaks down. So we hope that that will cover probably most of the electricity during the summer and make a big difference. I mean, near the end. Move on quickly. Right, my final points then. In the UK, we've had quite a few of these community energy societies set up recently. The idea is to encourage crowdfunding. People who live locally can invest in the project, and they put PV and other renewable energy on community buildings. I've set up with these other 2 chaps our own community energy society. It's an industrial and problem society using rules and regulations that are quite ancient, some Victorian times, but they suit a mutual company quite well, that each member only has 1 vote, no matter what shares they have. You can only have £20,000 worth of shares, and the shares are not transferable, and their value doesn't change. So it's not like an ordinary company. But I just, and working for South Somerset, I've helped set up a community energy society there as well, and this particular society have already installed quite a lot. You can see a lot of PV actually installed there. Now, we had until for a while we had a lot of support for community energy. So we had this support here, but unfortunately, the government we have now, only sort of 8 months old, they wanted to persuade potential UK independence voters to vote Conservative, and these types of people, they don't like wind turbines, they don't like renewable energy. So our new government have actually legislated you can no longer get permission for onshore wind turbines, absolutely impossible. The feed-in tariff has been cut, so there's now no longer a business case. And they've taken away the tax relief we had for community investment. So we're all quite depressed at the moment, and we can't wait for a new government. So it's quite disappointing, but we'll keep going one way or another.